cost of living survey which we run is undertaken 2 times per year. It's undertaken every 6 months in March and September. So the results which we will be presenting today reflect the results of our September 2011 cost of living survey, the results of which were provided to our clients this month in November. We've been carrying out this survey. We've been running this survey now for over 30 years, and we currently run this survey in over 400 locations around the world. Of those 400 locations, we include 50 cities in Asia, including approximately 20 cities in mainland China. The reason why we run this survey is to help multinational companies when they're moving staff, when they're sending staff around the world, to help them determine salaries and allowances in order to maintain the purchasing power of their staff who they send overseas. So the reason why this data is provided to companies to help them determine allowances to protect their employees' purchasing power when they're working outside of their home location. This year you'll see that, for example, Tokyo is ranked #1 worldwide. Hong Kong is ranked in the 50s, and the rankings are influenced or affected by 2 things. They're affected #1 by prices, and they're affected secondly by exchange rates. How we collect the data which determines these rankings is we have a basket of goods and services. So we collect prices of the basket of goods, which includes about 130 items, which reflect a person's day-to-day consumption pattern. So when we run the survey, we collect prices in all of these 400 locations, and then we convert the prices into a common currency in order to compare relative cost of living around the world. A location's position in the rankings can increase and it can decrease. For example, we've seen that Hong Kong's position in the rankings has fallen in comparison to last year, and I'll provide more details on that later. But the reason why a location can change is #1, due to changes in that location. For example, if prices increase in Hong Kong, then Hong Kong should go up in our ranking. But the ranking is also affected by the fact that other locations are in the ranking. So even if prices increase in Hong Kong, if prices in other locations increase at a faster rate, that means they will overtake Hong Kong. So they may actually cause Hong Kong to fall. So the position in the rankings is obviously affected by the location, but it's also affected by what happens in the other 390 locations which we survey. Over the course of the last year, we've seen that there's been a lot of pressure on prices, not just in Hong Kong, but throughout the world. Now, as mentioned before, prices in Hong Kong have increased by an average of 7% based on our basket of goods. However, this is actually lower than the regional average. Now, of the 50 locations which we survey in Asia, the average rate of inflation based on our basket of goods is 8%. So while rates in Hong Kong are high, they're lower than the regional average. And we see high inflation in Asia, but particularly in developing locations, where the main causes of inflation have been the increases in commodity prices and basic goods and services, things like food, oil, gas, electricity, meals out, and so on. Things that in developing locations people spend a larger amount of their income on. So hence why in developing locations we're seeing higher rates of inflation. China, as mentioned, 9%. Both India and Vietnam, you have the figures in front of you, but they have double-digit rates of inflation of anywhere between 10 and 15%. So it's the developing locations in Asia which are the most affected. On the other hand, we see low inflation in the more developed locations. For example, Japan. In spite of the impact of the nuclear disaster and the tsunami in March, that hasn't had a significant impact on the prices of goods and services that people pay at the supermarket. So we've not seen a knock-on effect on inflation in Japan. Likewise, Korea, Taiwan, they all have relatively low rates of inflation. So one of the reasons why Hong Kong, in spite of the fact that it's a developed city or a developed location, has high rates of inflation, is because Hong Kong, because it's a small location, it imports a large amount of the items that you'll find in a supermarket. Because of that, it's affected by things such as inflation elsewhere and currency fluctuations. However, if you look at somewhere such as Japan, what most people will purchase in a supermarket is locally produced, is locally made. So people there are protected against exchange rate fluctuation. However, if we look at Hong Kong on the other hand, if you go to a supermarket, most of your items that you purchase will come from China. So therefore, we're affected by inflation in China as well. The reason being is, obviously, if you buy fruit and vegetables in a supermarket in Hong Kong, it comes from China, and farmers obviously expect to be paid in renminbi. So as their prices go up, as they charge more for their items, people who import those goods into Hong Kong, firstly, they have to pay more renminbi in comparison to last year. And again, because of the exchange rate, they have to pay more Hong Kong dollars in comparison to last year. So that has a knock-on effect of in terms of the prices that we pay in supermarkets. So that's how Hong Kong is affected, whereas other developed locations are less affected by the current high rates of inflation that we see in Asia. We see that Tokyo remains the most expensive location in Asia, and this is followed by other Japanese locations, including Nagoya, Yokohama, etc. And we do not expect this to change for the next 2 to 3 years. The gap in cost of living between Japan and other locations remains very significant. So even if locations like Singapore and Seoul, which make up 5th position and 4th position respectively, even if they become more expensive, they probably will not overtake Japan for the immediate future. Having said that, Singapore, we've seen, is overtaking Hong Kong, and also Hong Kong has now been overtaken by both Beijing and Shanghai. But there is very little difference now in the cost of living between these locations. So perhaps no more than 5 or 10% separates the cost of living difference between Hong Kong and these locations. So that means in future surveys, we're likely to see some changes in the rankings. Maybe Beijing will overtake Singapore, or Shanghai will overtake Beijing, or even Hong Kong may actually retake its positions from Beijing or Shanghai. So we may expect to see some volatility on Hong Kong's ranking in comparison to other cities, particularly Beijing, Shanghai and Singapore in the next year or 2 years. But on the whole, Asian locations have generally become more expensive. Of the 50 locations that we survey, over 70% are now higher in our rankings than they were last year. So relatively speaking, Asia is becoming a more expensive location for companies when they're sending staff on assignments. Only 20% are relatively cheaper, and as mentioned, Hong Kong is included in this minority.